Shalom, y'all. My normal greeting, and it's good to be back up here in Indiana. Native Americanapolis. They need to change that Indianapolis name. But Teilhard de Chardin, in a poll, what was that book that came out about 15 years ago, 20 years ago on the New Age? And according to that lady that wrote that book, Pierre Teilhard was the most influential person for all of the New Agers back then. And he certainly is into metaphysics and New Age and all that kind of stuff. He's one of the worst, if I might say. And he is not within the pale of Christian orthodoxy at all. Catholic or certainly not Protestant or biblical. My middle son, I was on faculty for 7 years at Liberty University and Seminary, and they had the seminary students reading Richard Foster's book. And my son went through their seminary and complained furiously, but they didn't do anything about it. I know, since I'm a graduate of Dallas Seminary, they shifted in the early 2000s from the spiritual life to spiritual formation. See, that puts an emphasis on that kind of metaphysical spirituality that the last speaker was talking about. So, I just had a few comments there before we get into Islam. So we see here that Islam was founded, by Muhammad about almost 600 years after Christianity began, and he was an illiterate Arab tribesman born in Mecca in the deserts of Arabia. And he claimed the angel Gabriel spoke to him, and as a result, since he was illiterate, various scribes wrote the Quran for him in the early 600s. Some people think the main scribe was a Jewish guy who wrote it down for him. And the Quran contains 114 chapters called surahs, 6,666, interesting number, called ayahs. And there's different translations, and they don't like to translate the Quran. They want you to learn Arabic and read it in the original. So they call it a paraphrase or a commentary or something like that when it's translated. And I remember going to Saudi Arabia in the year 2000, and basically they gave me a bunch of papers and stuff about the history of Christianity in Arabia, and basically half of Arabia considered itself Christian at the time in which Islam began to rise. And Muhammad's fellow Arab tribesmen told him to convince the Jews that he was a prophet. And the Jews rejected Muhammad's claim because of his ignorance of the Bible. And this represents the beginning of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Well, probably, maybe, because it goes back, I think, to Abraham and Ishmael and those guys, actually. But Christians reject the Quran because Jesus is called the Son of Mary, never the Son of God. In fact, if you go to the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, in Arabic written up above, it says, God has no son, God has no son, God has no son. And that was a big early Islamic anti-Christian polemic there. Muslims consider Christians polytheists because we believe in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And Ishmael, Muhammad claimed that Ishmael rather than Isaac was God's chosen son of Abraham. So they distort the Bible and make him the chosen one rather than Yitzhak, Isaac. Parents of Ishmael were Abram and Hagar, Sarah's maidservant. Now, God did say that Ishmael would be father of a great nation, and he had 12 sons also. which basically led to the Arab people. And the angel of the Lord told Hagar before Ishmael was born that he would be a wild donkey of a man, and his hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. Now, people ask you to speak on what the Bible says about Islam. The Bible doesn't say anything about Islam directly. But Islam incorporated a lot of Arab culture and things into it. And here you have a prophecy about Ishmael and his descendants and how they would have their hand against one another. And this is obviously true to form in the history of the Arabs and Islam. And this is one of the reasons I baptized a imam who was in the country he came from, which was Shiite. He was the top imam, and he became a Christian recently. And we met for a year and a half, and he was telling me a lot, and he was Shiite background. And he was telling me the differences between Islam and within Shia and Sunni. And part of it is the Iranians, Persians, felt superior to the camel jockeys, that's what they called them, in Arabia, and therefore they had to have their own kind of Islam, you see. And, the Persians historically have been pretty brilliant people, and that's one of the main reasons, in his opinion, and he studied in Qum for 17 years. He had a PhD from there in Islamic studies. And his wife, he wasn't from Iran, but his wife was Iranian. And he was, telling me a lot about all that stuff. So Islam means surrender. That is, Allah wants man to submit to him under all circumstances to secure man's total obedience. And Muhammad was born in 570, AD 570. And in 595, he marries a rich widow. And in 610, the beginning of Quranic revelation to Muhammad began during Ramadan, which was a pre-Islamic feast that they had related to their animism, worship of other gods and everything that he imported into Islam. And the flight to Medina by Muhammad and followers to rescue persecution from Meccan tribes. They were trying to wipe them out, the tribes at Mecca, because they didn't want to submit to Muhammad. And that became the first year of the Islamic calendar in 622. So in 627, Muhammad and his forces execute 800 Jews of the Bani Qadfil tribe, and that was their first massacre. And of course, the Jews and eventually the Christians take on a bad omen, so to speak, within the Quran. And so the Quran is the main holy book, but they have the Hadith, which is huge, basically commentaries that are supposedly writings of things Muhammad said. And so you have a lot of repetition in the Quran. And 27 times the story of Moses' confrontation with the Egyptian Pharaoh, but it excluded the most integral component, the Passover. That's removed. Hebrews 9:22 says, in fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. And that's why you can't know. Even Muhammad supposedly did not know if he was going to go to heaven or not. You just really can't know. You don't know, because God's so arbitrary in their belief system. 28 times it retells the story of Noah and the biblical flood, so that's a big event. 14 times the story of Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah. It's one of the reasons homosexuality is not real big in Islam, although it may be bigger than we think. The Quran threatens hellfire, wrath, eternal judgment, and perdition 783 times. So they're the real hellfire preachers, so to speak. In contrast, the Bible's Old Testament mentions hell 31 times, the New Testament 74 times. The 5 pillars of Islam that you have to agree with to become a Muslim are: number 1, faith in Allah and Muhammad as prophet. Secondly, prayer 5 times a day toward Mecca. And you have to tithe or give your money, of course. And then Ramadan is a month-long fast from dawn to sunset for a month. And then the Hajj, Islamic religious pilgrimage to Mecca, if you're able to do it financially. And supposedly if you're financially able to do it and you don't, that's bad. And Islam is a warring religion. In fact, every country that Islam dominates today was taken over by the sword. Every country where Islam dominates today was militarily conquered. And that's why most Muslims don't want a negotiated peace with Israel. They believe they have to conquer it, because Islam involves doing what Muhammad did. Dressing like him, eating like him, living like him. If you're having your beard the same way that he did, supposedly, and all of this kind of stuff. And so Muhammad, whose apparently vocation was raiding caravans, I don't know what job training you get for that, but nevertheless, that was his job. And as a result, they have a warlike mentality throughout their history. So jihad, Muslim holy war, is not a pillar, but it's the highest duty of the Muslim. The Quran exhorts believers to wage jihad against unbelievers in over 100 verses. O Prophet, strive hard against the unbelievers and the hypocrites. A hypocrite would be a Muslim who's not living that way. And be firm against them. Their abode is hell, an evil refuge indeed. Surah 9:73. And after Muhammad's death in AD 632, Muslim armies overrode Jerusalem, Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage. Eventually, Islamic forces controlled all of North Africa, Syria, Asia Minor, Spain, and Portugal. They even controlled part of the Netherlands for a while. Muslims invaded France, reaching within 300 miles of England, but were stopped in the Battle of Tours in 732. That was a big turning point by Charles Martel. And also they were stopped in the city of Wien. Goodness, how is that in English? Vienna, thank you. I never can remember. Somehow I remember it in German, but not in. So the Muslim slave traders between 652 and 1276, Nuba, now called Sudan, was forced to send an annual contingent of slaves to Cairo. In other words, slavery is still big and practiced within Islam today, a pretty good kept secret, in the West. In 781, at the sack of Ephesus in Turkey, 7,000 Greeks were deported into captivity. In 903, at the sack of Thessaloniki, as they call it today, 22,000 Christians were divided among the Arab chieftains and sold into slavery. In the mid-1300s, under Ottoman Sultan Akhan, a periodic taking of 1 of 5 of all Christian children in conquered territories were taken, converted to Islam, and trained as either protectors of the Sultan or as an infantryman. They used a lot of captured Christian young people and raised them as the main fighters as they would go out and expand Islam. From 1656 until the 18th century, children from 6 to 10 were trained in the harem of the Sultan. And so Mecca was a small town. Animism was the dominant religion. Christianity was making inroads in those days, and there's the cabal in the middle where people would come once a year to march around it. This is before Islam, and this is one of the reasons they incorporated this in, to worship Allah, who was the moon god, and one of many from the pantheon of gods. And they were upset when Muhammad came along, and they felt that because this was a big part of their economy, that they didn't want to lose that. So he incorporates it into Islam, the Hajj. And so you have that box that they famously march around now for about 1,500 years. And this is the cabal. There it is today, surrounded by, ornament buildings and things like this. And y'all have heard about the trial of the blind sheik who first bombed the World Trade Center before the big one happened in 9/11. Well, you know why he was blind? Because a lot of, or not a lot, but some devout Muslims will go to the Hajj and they will cut their eyes and blind themselves so that the last thing they saw was this cabal here. And that shows their devoutness. So, difference between Christianity and Islam. Islam is a religion in which God requires you to send your son to die for him. Christianity is a faith in which God sent his son to die for you. And that was said by John Ashcroft, who's a Christian when he was Attorney General. And so we move to more recent times, and as we start to look at the rise of ISIS within Islam, you have the Sykes-Picot Agreement in May 1916, while the war was still going on, and French and British generals got together and decided after the war to divide the land as they drew lines on the map in the Middle East based on oil. They didn't take into account tribal diversity or religious diversity or any of those traditional things, and that's why you end up with something like Iraq, which has Shiites and Sunnis and Christians all mixed together. And it was okay, they got along, I guess you would say, under someone who was a dictator like Saddam Hussein, who maintained that central force until we came along and disturbed that. But many Muslims blame everything on the West coming in and imposing outside influence on them, and that's why we're the great Satan, is because we were the most powerful of the Western powers today. And there's some terms you need to know: Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam. And so Muslims believe that there should be a single entity known as Dar al-Islam. In other words, you shouldn't have countries. And you should just have those that are under Islam, and they should be a single entity. And that's what has been going on, for the last 50 years. Everybody from, who was that guy down in Egypt, Nasser, was trying to be the strong man to unite the Islamic world and get all those resources, you see, and build a strong Islamic empire. And Saddam Hussein was trying that. That's why he attacked the Shiites. They had that long 10-year war there that ended in a tie, pretty much. And this is what's been going on in the last 10 years, especially between Iran, which is the leading nation of the Shiite Muslims, and Saudi Arabia, which is the leading nation for the Sunnis, is who's going to reestablish the caliphate. In other words, Dar Islam, Dar al-Islam. And then there's Dar al-Harab, the house of war. And that's outside of Islamic countries, that there should be continual war or jihad against them to bring them under the house of Islam, see? So that they divide the world into those two categories. And you have the Sunnis, which are Saudi Arabia. Arabia is the main place. 75 to 80% of the Muslims in the world are Sunni. And then you have the Shiites. There's other branches as well, but these are the two main branches, 15 to 20%. And Iran is the center, their religious center there. And they split within a generation of Muhammad over the leadership of Islam, is basically what it started. But there are other differences now between them that I'm not going to go into. And the caliphate is where you have a single ruler over Islam. And up until ISIS has come along, that last single ruler was a Turk, head of the Turkish Empire, was considered the caliphate. Although in the late 1800s, a leader in Egypt named Muhammad Ali, not the fighter, of course, he split Egypt off from that caliphate, so it began to deteriorate in the late 1800s. And so what you have going on here the last decade is a fight of who's going to reestablish the caliphate, you see. And that explains this tension between the Sunnis and the Shiite Muslims. And ISIS refers to, that's an acronym, the Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Sham. And ISIL, if you want to throw in the Levant, which is the area where Israel's at, and broader area, in other words, the Eastern Mediterranean area. And then you have, it is in a Sunni outgrowth of the Sunni Triangle in northern Iraq. In other words, that's where the Sunnis live. And Saddam Hussein was Sunni, but the majority of the Muslims in Iraq have been Shiites. And that's why you have Iran, who provided a lot of the improvised explosive devices and weapons and all this stuff for the Taliban and other people that we were fighting there during that particular war. And when they got the prime minister, he was a Shiite, and he basically ignored the Sunnis. And so because of the dissatisfaction of the local Sunni population had with how the central Iraqi Shiite dominant government was denying them their rights and ruling with an iron hand, and that's where ISIS came from. So this is the former Prime Minister Maliki. Most of you probably heard of him and seen him on the news. And when the Obama administration and Maliki failed to reach a status force agreement, and a lot of analysts think that this was on purpose on both sides. They really didn't want this. Obama really didn't want to leave any troops in Iraq, and that's ended up what happened. Our absence allowed Maliki to restructure his emerging government into a traditional Shia-based one-man band. In other words, he became the dictator. And he purged all of the component Sunni military leadership and replaced them with mostly proven, incompetent Shia, therefore significantly weakening the new army the United States has struggled so hard to build. And that's why these people are not doing very well in their battles with ISIS, is because we trained a bunch of their troops and everything, and they were pretty confident, but then they got rid of those guys, you see, and put totally different leadership in, and had Sunni trained guys who turn around and run when they face the enemy. Now, my middle son is a chaplain in the Army, and he was with the 101st Airborne in his first deployment about 5 years ago over there. And he said the Nationals, every time there'd be a firefight, would always run. Anyway, back then. And now they don't have the Americans there to fight them. But nevertheless, he trumped up charges against the vice premier, who was a Sunni, and chased him into the desert. The Sunni population of Iraq was disenfranchised and pretty much left to their own devices, but at a distinct disadvantage compared to the Shia brethren. From this condition, ISIS arose under the leadership of many of Saddam Hussein's former generals who were disenfranchised by the Shiites. And so that's where ISIS came from. And so you can see this general area pointed out is what pretty much ISIS controls today. And they have reestablished the caliphate, supposedly. And ISIS, that's their flag. Governance is extremely well organized with infrastructure for a relatively mature nation. It manages social services, revenue collection, services, security, military operations, religious management, interpretation, and suicide elements. Yeah, a minister of suicide, I guess, is what you have in some of these governments. But it is a real government, albeit religious-based, at least from the public view. Its occupation is marked by strict Sharia law, taxation, imprisonment, and explosion of non-believers. Expulsion, I'm sorry. Guess I was on that suicide thing there. People viewed as unwilling to provide 100% loyalty are either beheaded, otherwise executed, or forced out. Compromise and assimilation are not ISIS words. Extreme purity of cause is stated as the basis for the style of occupation. And so this is one of the most hardcore forms of Islam ever formulated. And it has considerable wealth from a combination of Iraqi and Syrian oil, local taxation, and revenues received from other Sunni elements. It's primarily Saudi Arabian. It has a very sophisticated global social network engagement program, which demonstrates considerable psychological and cultural awareness to attract foreign fighters and support from dissatisfied members of Western nations. So far, they are credited with attracting more than 20,000 foreign personnel to the cause. These newly available ISIS assets range from sex slaves to frontline fighters to suicide bombers, and no one is more enthused about a cause than a recent convert, and that's by a report by Keith Nightingale, who is a retired full-bird colonel from the Army, who wrote an article entitled ISIS for the Common Man. And here's the new caliph, Baghdadi, and he was just a pretty average guy up until recently when he became the head of ISIS. He has a bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD in Islamic studies, and he's a pretty smart guy, and he's been very successful. And he declared the Islamic State, the Caliphate, on April 8th, 2013, so almost 2 years now. And here is an excellent article in the New Republic. It's considered the best article on ISIS by Graham Wood. And he says the Islamic State is no mere collection of psychopaths. It's a religious group with carefully considered beliefs, among them that it is a key agent of the coming apocalypse. See, we have prophecy conferences. They have prophecy movements. They're out doing something, which shows a difference in our eschatology. So we're waiting for the Lord from heaven, because he's going to do it all. And we often get misrepresented as people who have to go out and do, 4 or 5 things for Christ to return, and that's not the case. But these people believe they have to do things for the end times to come and for Islam to advance. So here's what that means for its strategy and how, and he writes an article on all of that. And Zakari is a guy who influenced this Baghdadi guy, and the state he spawned takes the position that many other acts can. I think this thing messed up on me here. Yep, it's not formatted correctly. It's not showing the entire thing, which I did not anticipate that happening. But well, so this is talking about how they believe that they are advancing the Islamic end time agenda, and their goal is to purify the world from unbelief. And this is an Australian preacher named Musa Caratonio, and he is a follower of these guys, although he's not officially a follower, otherwise he'd be put in jail in Australia. But one of ISIS's most influential recruiters, and he believes it is foretold that the caliphate will sack Istanbul before it is beaten back by an army led by the anti-Messiah, in other words, the Antichrist, whose eventual death, when just a few thousand jihadists remain, will usher in the apocalypse. So they believe, the ISIS people, and this is not in the Quran or anything, but this is just stuff that developed in their view of prophecy. Actually, the Quran is pretty benign. It doesn't have much prophecy in it. It just talks about the end times, the last day, and all of this. And they've come in from the Hadith and added all of this other stuff. I even read once where some guy read Hal Lindsey back in the 80s and gave a Quran, an Islamic version of Hal Lindsey type with more details, based somewhat on Christian eschatology and things. So they believe that there's going to be a big battle at Istanbul, which is Turkey, of course, used to be Constantinople, and that the righteous, in this case ISIS, will be down to a couple hundred men when Muhammad or somebody will show up and turn it around or something like that. So people ask, is ISIS un-Islamic? And many mainstream Muslim organizations have gone so far as to say that the Islamic State is in fact un-Islamic, and of course our president holds that view. It is, of course, reassuring to know that the vast majority of Muslims have zero interest in replacing Hollywood movies with public executions as evening entertainment. But Muslims who call the Islamic State un-Islamic are typically, as the Princeton scholar Bernard Haeckel, the leading expert on the group's theology, told me, embarrassed and politically correct with a cotton candy view of their own religion that neglects what their religion has historically and legally required. Many denials of Islamic State religious nature are rooted in an interfaith Christian nonsense tradition. Yeah, in other words, they're liberal Muslims. And according to Haeckel, the ranks of the Islamic State are deeply infused with religious vigor. Quranic questions are ubiquitous. Even the foot soldiers spout this stuff constantly, Haeckel said. They mug for their cameras and repeat their basic doctrines in formulaic fashion, and they do it all the time. He regards the claim that the Islamic State has distorted the text of Islam as preposterous, sustainable only through willful ignorance. People want to absolve Islam, he said. It's this Islam is a religion of peace mantra, as if there was such a thing as Islam. It's what Muslims do and how they interpret their texts. These texts are shared by all Sunni Muslims, not just the Islamic State. And these guys have just as much legitimacy as anyone else. So all Muslims acknowledge that Muhammad's earliest conquests were not tidy affairs, and that the laws of war passed down in the Quran and in the narrations of the Prophet's rule were calibrated to fit a turbulent and violent time. In Heikel's estimation, the fighters of the Islamic State are authentic throwbacks to early Islam and are faithfully reproducing its norms of war. I guess they would be considered fundamentalists, getting back to the origins of Islam. This behavior includes a number of practices that modern Muslims tend to prefer not to acknowledge as integral to their sacred texts. Slavery, crucifixion, and beheadings are something that freakish jihadists or cherry picking from the medieval tradition, Heikel said. Islamic State fighters are smack in the middle of the medieval tradition and are bringing it wholesale into the present day. The Quran specifies crucifixion as one of the only punishments permitted for enemies of Islam. The tax on Christians finds clear endorsement in Surah Al-Tawbah, the Quran's 9th chapter, which instructs Muslims to fight Christians and Jews until they pay the jizya, or tax, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. The Prophet, whom all Muslims consider exemplary, imposed these rules and owned slaves. Now, you often hear Muslims say that they want peace, like in Israel or the Middle East. Well, what they mean by peace is a return to the dominance of Islam and everyone else functioning as dhimmis. In other words, a third-class citizen who pays the annual tax, and along with dhimmihood, you can't accumulate much wealth beyond bare existence. You have to walk on the other side of the street if you meet a Muslim. You can't look them in the eye. You can't ride anything more than a donkey. See, that's what it means to be a dhimmi, and that's what they mean when they say peace. They want peace, a return to Islam being in rulership over everything else. Leaders of the Islamic State have taken emulation of Muhammad as strict duty and have revived traditions that have been dormant for hundreds of years. And while striking about them is not just the literalism, what's striking about them is not just the literalism, but also the seriousness with which they read these texts, Heikel says. There is an assiduous, obsessive seriousness that Muslims don't normally have. Nevertheless, the Caliphate has continued to embrace slavery and crucifixion without apology. We will conquer your Rome, break your crosses, and enslave your women, Adami, the spokesman, promised in one of his periodic valentines to the West. If we do not reach that time, then our children and grandchildren will reach it, and they will sell your sons as slaves at the slave market. Why? That's what Muhammad did. And Melanie Phillips is a Jewish commentator in England that I really like. Her parents immigrated from Hungary, and she was a liberal for a number of years, and in the last 20 or so years, she's turned things around. She's written a book called London Stand, How Britain is Creating a Terrorist State Within. That's been out over 10 years. And a book called The World Turned Upside Down, The Global Battle Over God, Truth, and Power. And she talks about how secular Britain and Europe and the United States have abandoned their Christian roots, their Judeo-Christian roots that built the culture, and secularism has nothing to offer. It's empty. And as a result, it's led to multiculturalism, where no culture is superior to another, except they're opposed to the Judeo-Christian culture. And therefore, she thinks that most of the terrorists that are arising in England are the children of immigrants. In other words, let's say a Turkish family immigrated to England to get a job. They weren't necessarily devout Muslims, and their kids grow up in this secular environment in Great Britain, and Islam, radical Islam, is attractive to them, because of the meaninglessness of Western culture, you see. And so that's where the radicals are coming from. And so I recommend you look up a lot of her lectures on YouTube. She's just extremely articulate and explains a lot of stuff going on. Volume.
We don't really have the overall message that I wish to convey, and why I wrote the book, and I feel this even more strongly now. We don't really realize in Britain and America that terrorism is not the biggest threat we face. The much bigger threat is the ideology that drives it, and it's not enough just to fight terror. The principal battleground is the world of ideas, and the Islamists do understand this. But we haven't even understood that this is where the real battleground is. We're not even on this battleground, and so we let the lies stand. And as a result, we allow and encourage these lies to take root in the minds of our enemies, fueling the hysteria and the hatred, and we've allowed them to take root in the minds of our own people who are the victims of this terrible thing, allowing them to become demoralized and confused. The liberal West, which worships at the shrine of reason and makes such a fetish of the power of the intellect, does not understand that ideas can kill. And as a result, we have all, Britain, America, Europe, and Israel, we've all left the battleground of ideas totally undefended, allowing the unhindered advance of falsehood and hatred. And worse still, our intelligentsia and our media often act as the Islamists' fifth column. And it's only if we act against this ideology that is spreading this falsehood and hatred and stop its advance under the seductive umbrella of minority rights that we have any chance of defending the free world. And that means, while showing respect to Muslims who derive only spiritual sustenance from their faith, we must reassert Western values and resist any attempt to subvert them. It also means facing down in public much more robustly than we do the lies spread about the West and about Israel. Only if we stop deluding ourselves in the way that we have been, and only if we take this kind of action that is, in my view, essential for our survival, will we stop what is so disastrously happening, this sleepwalking to defeat. Thank you very much.
Before the caliphate, maybe 85% of the Sharia was absent from our lives. That the ISIS people believe these laws were in abeyance until we have a caliphate, and now we have one. Without a caliphate, for example, individual vigilantes are not obliged to amputate the hands of thieves that they catch in the act, but create a caliphate, and this law, along with a huge body of other jurisprudence, suddenly awakens. In theory, all Muslims are obliged to immigrate to the territory where the caliphate is applying these laws. That's why you have all these people wanting to go there, you see, because they're so excited. And that fits into their view of Bible prophecy, or Quranic prophecy, rather. In theory, all Muslims are obliged to immigrate to the territory where the caliphate is applying these laws. The caliphate is required to implement Sharia. Any deviation will compel those who have pledged allegiance to inform the caliphate in private of this error, and in extreme cases to excommunicate and replace the caliphate if he persists. So Sharia has been misunderstood because of its in places like Saudi Arabia, where they say they only partially apply it, because they don't have a caliphate there, you see, and like they chop your arms off and stuff if you steal, and they say that they're really not obligated to do that there. The Islamic State may have medieval-style punishments for moral crimes, lashes for boozing or fornication, stoning for adultery, but its social welfare program is, at least in some aspects, progressive to a degree that would please a MSNBC pundit. It's pretty funny. Health care, he said, is free. Isn't it free in Britain too, I asked. Not really, he said. Some procedures aren't covered, such as vision. This provision of social welfare has not, he says, a policy choice of the Islamic State, but a policy obligation inherent in God's law, they believe. During the last years of the U.S. occupation of Iraq, the Islamic State's immediate founding fathers, by contrast, saw signs of the end times everywhere. They were anticipating within a year the arrival of the Mahdi. And I think the Mahdi's already been explained here. He's probably, I don't believe that the Antichrist is going to be Islamic. He's going to be from revived Roman Empire, even though there's a fad in that direction. But he really is a satanic type character from a biblical perspective. But he is a guy who is supposedly going to revive Islam and bring it to its ultimate victory and the conquering over the whole world, and thus the ruling of Islam over the whole world. And so for certain true believers, the king who longed for epic good versus evil battles, visions of apocalyptic bloodbaths, fulfill a psychological need. Now, this is this guy's article here. Of the Islamic State supporters I meet, many express the deepest interest in the apocalypse, and he's using the word apocalypse. They do not have any literature that is apocalyptic or called, prophetic or end times. He's using it to refer to the end times in a broad way, and how the remaining days of the Islamic State in the world might look. Parts of that prediction are recent speculation, see, and do not yet have the status of doctrine. But other parts are based on mainstream Sunni sources. See, it's not in the Quran, and appear all over the Islamic State's propaganda. These include the belief that there are only 12 legitimate caliphates, and Baghdadi is the 8th, that the armies of Rome will mass to meet the armies of Islam in northern Syria, and that Islam's final showdown with an anti-Messiah, in other words, they would say the Antichrist, they could have in mind Jesus Christ actually, will occur in Jerusalem after a period of renowned Islamic conquests. See, so they think they're starting this conquest. Islamic State has attached great importance to the Syrian city of Dabiq near Aleppo. That's in northern Syria. It named its propaganda magazine after the town and celebrated madly when at great cost it conquered Dabiq's strategically unimportant plains. It is here, the prophet reportedly said, that the armies of Rome will set up their camp. The armies of Islam will meet them, and Dabiq will be Rome's Waterloo or its Antietam. Dabiq is basically all farmland, one Islamic State supporter recently tweeted. You can imagine large battles taking place there. The Islamic State's propagandists drool with anticipation of this event and constantly imply that it will come soon. The State's magazine quotes Zakari, who is the intellectual influence on Baghdadi, who is the caliphate, as saying, the spark has been lit here in Iraq and its heat will continue to intensify till it burns the Crusader armies in Dabiq. That's why it was so bad when Obama referred to the Crusades the other day. It's just what the Muslims want to hear. And there is that city, as you can see, as the red arrow points to up at the top. And that's some important city that they believe events will happen. And here's their magazine. It's called Dabiq. That's the magazine, the name of the magazine, and that they put out. And they believe that some fateful events will happen there. So that means they believe they're in the end times here. So now that it has taken Dabiq, the Islamic State awaits the arrival of an enemy army there whose defeat will initiate the countdown of the apocalypse. Western media frequently miss references to Dabiq in the Islamic State's videos and focus instead on lurid scenes of beheading. Here we are burying the first American crusader in Dabiq. Eagerly, I can see some guy sending a picture back home to mom. Here we are burying the first American crusader, Mom, in Dabiq, eagerly waiting for the remainder of your armies to arrive, said a masked executor in a November video showing the severed head of Peter Kassig, the aid worker who's been held captive for more than a year. During fighting in Iraq in December after Mujahideen reported having seen American soldiers in battle. So Islamic State Twitter accounts erupted in spasms of pleasure like the over-enthusiastic host of hostesses upon the arrival of the first guest at a party. So you have all of this end-time stuff going on, and this is an important thing, the reestablishment of the caliphate and all of these kinds of things. So I believe that Islam, after the rapture, in the Battle of Gog and Magog that Ron Rhodes has talked about, and what you have are non-Arab Islamic countries, plus Russia, that invade Israel, and I believe it will happen. It includes Persia or Iran. And you remember, I can't get a job. Ahmadinejad, yeah. That Israel must be wiped off the map. And as many Jewish commentators said, well, at least he has us on the map because most Muslims don't. And so this is their ultimate goal. And, you look at these names, and Ron briefly went over that, so I won't go over them myself. And it's a regional battle that I think will take place with a surprise attack on Israel from these different things. And I believe that it will take place in the latter days, which is a term in the Bible for the tribulation period. And I think it will take place basically after the rapture, but before the tribulation. I don't think it can take place before the rapture because it has to be tied into the tribulation. And that phrase in the Old Testament, latter days, is a technical term when it's used of the future, like it's used sometimes of the latter days of Abraham, which is not a prophetic usage. But it refers to the tribulation, or what we know as the 70th week of Daniel. And therefore, Islam will take a major defeat. And I think when you hit Islam in the mouth, they back down, because that's what happened to Muhammad. He went back to see if he had done something wrong after he lost in Mecca the first time. And he made a hudna, a temporary treaty, and then a couple of years later he went back and finally took it over. So this is what they do when you defeat them militarily. So I think that this very well could create the open pathway for the revived Roman Empire to then sign that covenant or impose a covenant, could be either one, on Israel that then leads to the events of the tribulation. So I think Islam and these people are not a major player in the tribulation, in the end times as we think. So, you got one question or two?
We've got time for one question.
Okay.
We've got time for one question. There he is. The man with the microphone. Yes.
the Phil Donahue of this church,
Not.
walking through the
Anybody have
crowd.
a question? Just raise your hand. I'll get the mic to you. People are getting hungry.
Well, there's one right to your left, right there.
Is our president, or the president, excuse me. Oh, is the president leaning towards Sunni or Shiite, do you believe?
I have no idea. But, well, he's, you know, if you follow the last 3 or 4 days of what's going on in, where? What's that? Yemen, yeah. He's supporting the Saudis and the Egyptians who came in and took that port city from the Hutus who had taken over in Yemen, which are Shiites. But every other area, he seems to be supporting Iran. And some people think that Obama's foreign policy is to make this deal with Iran and let them defeat ISIS. In other words, because they will dominate the Middle East and stuff. And of course, he's crazy, you know. I mean, because Iran is not creating, you know, missiles that can go anywhere in the world for nothing. And you don't even need missiles to nuke us. You know, you can just drive one in on a ship or something, and you know, and they've been practicing those kinds of things, blowing up imitation of the American aircraft carrier and all of that. And you know, right last Sunday, you know, death to America by their leader, you know, and those kinds of things. So, you know, our president is totally deluded about these kinds of things. Quick question back there. Yeah.
Sure. Hi. Some Christians believe that the Antichrist will come from the Islamic Caliphate.
Right.
But I think you said that you thought that the Antichrist would be from the revived Roman Empire.
Yes.
Okay. Conversely, do Islamics believe that they will have an anti-caliphate figure, and do they consider Jesus to be, in essence, their Antichrist?
No, they don't. They believe, I don't know about an anti-caliphate in Islam. You know, I'm not saying one way or the other, I don't know. But they believe Jesus will come back with Muhammad, and he will bow down to Muhammad and thus bring Christianity in line with Islam. Well, thank you. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the fact that you're in control of history and that Satan has produced his opposition to you in history. But of course, as Ron Rhodes read from Isaiah 46, that you have predetermined the things that will happen, and therefore we can, because you're a God worthy of our trust and our devotion and love, we can trust that you are simply allowing man to work out his rebellion against you in history, but you're going to bring order out of this chaos at some point. And we just thank you for the fact that you are in control, and we are looking forward to what it is that you have us to do in the meantime of evangelism and serving you faithfully. And so be with us as we go to lunch, and bless this time together in Christ's name.